we're kind of already to the point where we're like, well, yeah, of course there's ethnic nepotism, but it'll probably help out like the guy in Oklahoma at the end, right? So we know this is going to exist. We know this has happened. We know this is a function of human behavior. So this fear is not ridiculous. It's actually, deeply encoded for a reason because we can observe it on a regular basis. We all know it's real. And so that's the reason that, high degrees of ethnic diversity have always been a big problem for the countries that they exist in. Lee Kuan Yew said, in a multi-ethnic democracy, you vote your race and your religion, right? Not your politics. Ultimately, I think, a lot of people would like the United States to be able to settle in and find a balance, right? Like, I don't know if we're ever going to get a hard ethnogenesis, but we need something that actually kind of solidifies the American identity and allows people to build a level of trust between each other where they're not going to look at someone across the street who has a different skin color and say, that guy is gunning for my job, he's coming for all these things, right? But the way we create that is actually not to increase diversity. The way we do that is to slow the rate of change, right? The way that you actually let people look across the road and identify that person as their neighbor is allow them to build a system in which that person is their neighbor for a long time and there aren't new neighbors. When everyone from the British Isles and Western Europe got to the United States, they were largely ethnically located, right? That this is the core of Albion seed, the different the different groups that moved in. But over time, this becomes a quasi-American identity. You've still got the Scots-Irish, you've still got the Puritans, you've still got kind of those groups that define the areas they settled, but they kind of eventually, even though they had a number of conflicts over time, learn to see each other as more or less Americans. And the way that you do that is you don't constantly have new groups that have to carve out their own piece and their own, and the more diverse these groups are, the more radical it becomes. So when you had mostly Protestant guys from the British Isles, they might have had some differences, but ultimately there was enough bonding there where you could figure it out. When you brought in Catholics, things got a little dicey, and you had a lot of attempts to break up Catholic power in large cities because they were concentrating and changing the way that vote. You get the Wide Awakes and all these things, right? Like, this is throughout American history. This isn't some new problem that we're generating here. And once you get to the point where you're bringing in people from radically different religions who have radically different cultures and family structures and other understandings, you're only going to exacerbate this issue. And so, my point is that I would like America as it is now to identify itself as America, one unified culture and understanding, or at least to the degree it can, right? At least enough overlap to do that. And the best way to do that is to prefer the people who live here now and kind of cool down the immigration that has been running rampant for a very long time so that people can adjust and build those communities and build that trust. I think ultimately that's the thing that's going to eliminate the tension and the worry that we're talking about, not constantly bringing in as many people as possible in the hopes that that generates X number of advantages in any given industry, because really that's going to create more disruption than it is unity.
Yeah, well, okay, so that's interesting, because I agree with the first sort of half of what you said. You're like, we need to have people form a common American identity so there's not these distrustful suspicions and blah, blah, blah. But then the second thing, you're like, okay, if we keep bringing in new people, that's going to stop ethnogenesis. That's going to stop, which I think means people starting to see themselves as just American instead of, as like Irish or Italian or whatever. Right. And so I think, which I want people to just see themselves as American. I want American to be like an ethnicity, if you want, if you will. It's not a race, but maybe it can be an ethnicity. And so I think, but I want that. But then when I think of like, okay, so your argument is, okay, we pause, and then have everybody sort of, give people time to kind of come to see each other as just Americans, And I've heard that before, I've heard this idea before. But looking back at our history, I wonder if it's not the opposite, because Irish people were defined as, Catholics. They didn't necessarily think of them ethnically in terms of Irish, but they thought of them as Catholics, right? You had anti-Catholic stuff all the way up until the late 1800s. And actually, I mean, even when John F. Kennedy was elected, that was weird, because he's a Catholic, right?
Right.
Irish Catholic. Italians were thought of as like immigrant type of people long after it was like third, fourth generation people, all the way up until like the Karate Kid, right? he's got immigrant flavor because his name's LaRusso. It's not until new groups show up that the old groups fully assimilate. When I look at our history, because they define, the British and the Irish, the Protestants and the Catholics finally united when all the like Italians and Poles and Russian Jews like Lev and my ancestors, I guess, started showing up. And then those are the weirdos. Those are the new guys. And then who cares about Catholic versus Protestant when these new weird guys are showing up on our shores? So I wonder if it's not actually the opposite of what you're talking about.
So that's kind of true, but it actually leads to something far worse. So one of the reasons that we're seeing the rise in racial salience is because of the process you're talking about, right? So when those guys stopped being the weird guys, guess what they became? They didn't just become American, they became white, right? And white became the unifying identity of all of this, what is now the kind of old stock. And what did it unify against? All the non-white groups, right? So actually what you're increasing is the salience of race, and which I think is a far less holistic and healthy way to understand identity. I think ethnos is a far more historically stable way, and it also allows for cultivation of real culture and real binding in a way that race does not. But the more that you kind of use the system you're talking about to kind of make somebody old stock, what you're doing is you're making them old stock by collapsing them into broad racial categories. And eventually you run out of the option to do this, right? And so what you really just end up doing is manufacturing like a race war instead of allowing people to bind themselves into an ethnic identity. Sam Huntington wrote this great book, Who Are We? In that book, yeah, it's really good. And Huntington is obviously a man of like the center left. He's a Harvard professor. But he says that the Anglo Protestant identity has to be the core of the United States. He says that every group that came in, even if they were not Anglo-Protestant, had to assimilate to the norms of Anglo-Protestant. He points out that even Jewish and Catholic Americans became so Protestant in their mannerisms that they were weird to other Jews and other Catholics because they had particularly Protestant kind of flavors imprinted on top of those. And that's kind of what created that unified identity. And so again, I think that is something that's possible as long as you have a core identity you kind of know that people are going to assimilate to. You still are allowing for assimilation, but in that book, Huntington specifically says that the rate of immigration is radically making that assimilation impossible for several reasons, including the ethnic ghettos that get created, the space between the different peoples that are trying to assimilate, and basically because you water down that core stock understanding so significantly that the question isn't, should we be assimilating, but actually, no, we're just multicultural. And this creates the problem in which you just have a constant clash of civilizations inside your nation instead of something else. And so that's why I'm saying, I'm just with Huntington on this. I think that, identifying that Anglo-Protestant identity as the core thing people need to assimilate with, even if they aren't Anglo and they aren't Protestant, and they aren't going to become those things, and making it slow enough and making the gaps wide enough so that people can actually take the time to do that is much, much better than hoping that if we just like stuff enough people into the country fast enough, people will kind of collapse into, oh, well, I guess I'm American because I was in the last wave of this.
Well, yeah, so that's interesting. I don't. In terms of Anglo-Protestantness, I think like people assimilate to that without realizing they did. If you ask me, where do your ancestors come from, Noah? I would be like, well, Lithuania. But if you ask me, like, where is your parent civilization, I would say England, right? Like I just automatically think of like England as the place where my country's stuff all comes from. It's not entirely true, but it is what I think of. And even though my ancestors did not come from England, they not at all. We named ourselves Smith because people just could not pronounce Kuznets, and it was just. But yeah, so I think in terms of Anglo-Protestantness, the thought is there, even if the explicit acknowledgement is not. But in terms of what's this sort of core group, you're right that the last time we did this, it was white. It was like, you're white, I'm white. I think we kind of played it up. When people were lynching Italians by the dozens in New Orleans, or when there was all this panic about the East and South Europeans coming over to America, I don't think people were thinking, well, you're white, I'm white, hell yeah, white bros. No, I don't think people were thinking that. I think that sort of came about in like the 70s and 80s, where white became this thing like, hell yeah, we're all white. I think also that arose in response to black nationalism, which really flowered in like the 60s and 70s. I think that white was defined in opposition, not necessarily to new immigrants, but to black people at a time when the immigrant percentage of our population was really low. So here's an important point, which is that the era of sort of racial discord that we just had in America, which I thought kind of sucked. I did not like that. That was not our biggest era of racial discord in living memory. The biggest era of racial discord, even worse, was the late 60s and 70s. That was the peak. That was when you had, of course, we had another one before that in the 10s, but no one alive remembers that. So we had these massive race riots throughout all of America that destroy the cities. There's a reason we have the name inner city, and we just had incredible racial discord that like much more than like the Floyd protests. Floyd protests were a bunch of like angry, like anarchist leftist white kids going around burning stuff and fighting cops for fun. Like it was really a lot more racial. And I grew up, when I was a kid, I remember the LA riots, and the extreme racialization of that. I didn't see anything like that in the woke era, honestly. Like where just, mobs would just grab people of another race from like a truck and just beat them to death. Like I didn't see that happen in the woke era, in the Floyd protests. So I remember racial discord that was actually worse. I remember, and my parents lived through an era of racial discord that was worse than the one I just lived through. And yet that was at a time when the immigrant percentage of foreign-born percentage of America's population was at its lowest ever. Was the early, I think 1970 was our nadir in terms of like the lowest foreign-born percentage of our population we've ever had in the whole history of the country was 1970. And yet 1970 was like, that was when you would just get killed for being a white person in the wrong neighborhood or being a black person in the wrong neighborhood.
Well, it was also a culture clash. I mean, ultimately, if we're talking about what are these differences that even the people who were against the Irish and the Italians were talking about, yes, a lot of it had to do with the Pope, and, enough of your Roman popery, you remember from Gangs in New York. Yeah, exactly. But
now they take over the Supreme Court. Everyone's a cat, I think there's like one non-Catholic on the Supreme Court or something.
Yeah, there we go. So they were
right.
They were right.
No.
Yes, exactly.
Nothing knew something after all.
I mean, we're joking, but also, yes. But seriously,
don't you like the current Supreme Court? Aren't they the most?
Oh no, you're misunderstanding me. This is not to say that I'm like wildly objectionable to the current Supreme Court, its makeup, or even its belief system. Clarence Thomas is the best Supreme Court justice, and he's not exactly Anglo stock. That's fine, right? Like obviously he's extremely American. Like that's not the question. The point is, when we're pointing to this and we're saying, oh, well, those things don't happen and the nepotism doesn't exist and these preferences aren't created, well, that's observably incorrect. And yeah, we had a lot of racial strife at the times you're talking about, but we've got plenty now. And of course, we know that a high degree of hiring decisions have been made over the fact that people are white and therefore less desirable than people of other races for legally, instantiated reasons. And so we've created this system where we specifically, whether you want to kind of identify that group or not as, when it was forged, it is being forged now. And this is what I'm saying is we are actually getting an ethnogenesis of white Americans right now. It's just in the worst way possible. Because what creates the reason that black Americans had an ethnogenesis is that they lost all of their languages and all of their culture and all the things they were tied to, and they just had a shared experience of oppression. Right. And that is what forged black culture in a very real way. And that's why there was a black ethnos in America before there was a white ethnos in America, because they were othered and because they didn't have roots in founding ethnoses from, their original homelands. And so while, Irish and Polish and German Americans continued to carry on many of their, kind of identities separately, they didn't get forged together because they didn't have the shared oppressed situation in which they kind of lost that identity and were forged into one group. We're getting that now. Like now you have a lot of deracinated white guys. They don't have a tie to any specific culture religion, standing. The only thing that unifies them is that they lost the job that they were going for specifically because of the color of their skin, because they checked the wrong box on any given application. And that's what forges an ethnos, right? And that's actually not what you want. So again, my point is that the practices we're engaging in now are highly deleterious to creating an organic and healthy sense of identity. And until we sort those problems out, adding additional layers of complication to this process is basically just pouring as much gasoline onto a fire as possible in the hopes that eventually it'll just kind of burn itself out, which I think is really dangerous.
Well, I don't know about this, because I feel like the whole like importance of whiteness happened in the 60s and 70s. I feel like that was before. And that happened when we had the least foreign born that we've ever had. I don't think that whiteness is just now coming into being as an identity that people have that's important to them. I don't think that's happening as a result of DEI. I mean, maybe it'll solidify it. Maybe it'll contribute to it and further it. I agree. But I think that the original, the time when obviously white was always an important legal thing, right? But the time when everyone,
it existed in the 1790 naturalization,
yes. There was an
Immigration Act, right?
But and hilariously, we defined all indigenous Mexicans as white and all Middle Easterners as white for political reasons. But anyway, but in terms of what am I? Am I Protestant? Am I Irish? Am I Italian? No, I'm white. I think that happened in the 60s and 70s, and I think that happened. It didn't happen in response to immigrants, and it didn't happen in response to DEI. As a side note, DEI was made by white people, by liberal white people, but it didn't happen. It happened because of racial tensions between white and black people.
Sure, but
black people were already here, and it wasn't like.
It's because you had a large scale introduction of black Americans into white areas that had not existed previously, right? So what you're talking about is still the same process. You're just saying that before this America was bifurcated, and so then when we brought in, when we forced integration, we created a scenario in which we forged an ethnic identity for white Americans that didn't exist previously. You're still explaining exactly the same process. You're just saying the guys that were introduced were already here, and instead of we brought them in from somewhere else. But you're literally describing exactly the same thing. Now, because black Americans, I'm sorry?
Great migration and desegregation introducing black people.
Now, because black Americans are heritage Americans in the sense that they have been here in America as long, basically, as white Americans have been, and they have no other country to go to, that there was no additional choice to be made there, right? That was going to happen eventually. But we don't have to reintroduce more of that friction. We don't have to create more of that process. We still haven't solved the problem of the initial one we created. And so my point again being is, when you have a system that's closed, then we have the ability to make negotiations, right? Okay, we're having a difficult situation bringing black and white Americans together, but at least we have lived with each other. We know that we owe each other something. We know that we are at least all Americans in some sense, and we can work through those difficulties because there's a specific group that we need to be in dialectic with, right? I just made James Lindsay scream.
Good.
Yeah, I do it a lot, so we can bond over that. But the point being is, because we have those relationships and we're aware of them, and we know that there's a special relationship there, even if we have not solved that problem, there's a one-to-one there. One of the problems that Black America has had is it's lost its political power in many situations because it's vying with more minority ethnic groups for the same amount of kind of special privilege that we've assigned to the oppressed minority in the United States. And so rather than being lobby for a specific relationship, they have to fall into this large cluster of people who are all kind of squabbling, especially under civil rights legislation, for all of these kind of carve-outs that we've created. That's a huge problem because every one of those groups doesn't have the same experience as Black Americans. They don't have the same history. They don't have the same tradition. They don't have the same struggles, debt, that is owed to them, these kind of things. And so what I'm saying again is like, you're right that there was more ethnic tension at the time, but it was simply because we went through the first wave of a process that we are only increasing in its intensity. And it seems foolish until we at least get somewhere close to solving that problem, especially for a black community that's not doing particularly well in many areas because of it, that we continue to introduce people who will again need to have the same negotiation without the same history.